Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. Welcome to our video Buddhism 123. This format is a little different, of course, from our Buddhism 123 that we have at the temple, because we usually start with chanting, then meditation, and then a talk and discussion. And so these videos on Buddhism 123 are different from our Sunday Dharma talks in that they're a little more informal and educational. And we'll have some exercises during this and suggest some things afterward. We'll continue on our topic on Shin Buddhism, and that it is an ideal religion for the common working person. But Shin Buddhism has been slow to be accepted by Americans. And as I said earlier, I think there are a few reasons for this. One is that Shinran was in 13th century feudal Japan. And so the words and ideas that come from his time are taken in a different context from 21st century America. So we have the two things of time from 13th century feudal Japan to 21st century universal digital America. And then we have the difference of cultures. And so you see, even the translations of words sometimes don't fit the context of our modern era. Now, I've been presenting a method that has been useful in introducing Shin Buddhism to Westerners who don't have a background in Shin Buddhism or in Japanese culture. And one of the easiest ways to present this is to say that Shin Buddhism emphasizes what we have received. Many religions are about practicing to achieve something, to be somewhere else, to get something we don't have. But in Shin, the important time is right now, and what we reflect on is what we have already received. Now, Shinran writes in one of his wasans, "Voice Amida's name and be mindful of the Buddha always. Respond in gratitude to the great benevolence." Now, we recognize and respond to what we have already received. And a simple way to understand this without going through a lot of definitions is to use the word thank you, because we're all familiar with the word thank you and the experience that it holds. Now, I'm going to explain today why this little method works. For those of you who used our recommendation of last week of saying thank you when you washed your hands, I want to know, what was your feeling? Because unless we have a practice, the words that we say here are just ideas. But when we practice and actually do something, we put those ideas into an action that becomes a reality for us. So for those of you who did practice that, to say thank you when you washed your hands, what feelings occurred to you? Now, Shin Buddhism is very optimistic. Sometimes people think that Buddhism is pessimistic because we hear the words, life is suffering. I think a more accurate version would be that there is suffering in life. Now, Shinran writes in a poetic way in his Shoshinge. He says, "The light of the sun illuminates and protects us always. The clouds and mist of greed, desire, anger, and hatred cover the sky of truth. But beneath the clouds and mists, there is brightness, not dark." Now, the sun is always shining. What Shinran is saying is that it is our own desires, our clouds and mists, that hide the sun. Now that brings an important point. This perspective, this is the first of the Eightfold Path, wholesome views. And then what Shinran is saying here is that the first noble truth is that there is suffering in life, and that's represented by these clouds and the mist. The second noble truth says the cause of that is our own ego, our ego desires, our ignorance. And so our attachment to ignorance is what clouds the sun that's always shining. Now let's use the word please to represent this ignorance. The please means that we want something we don't have. And please is actually a fundamental way of life for us Americans. Our whole economy is based on what we want, and advertisers on TV and magazines and so forth are always telling us that we need to buy something that we don't have so that we can be happy. And so it's very difficult to shift from this position. But again, Shinran says right after his statement on the sun always shining and there's brightness under the clouds, he says, when one realizes truth, one immediately leaps crosswise, closing off the 5 grave offenses. So what happens when we leap crosswise? To demonstrate this, let's do this. You can't see my face, but if I were to leap crosswise, you can see my face. What that means is a shift of perspective. The sun is always there, but our clouds and ignorance has hidden that. And so it is just this crosswise leap that makes us realize that this brightness is always there. And so nothing changes on the outside. It is our perspective that changes. It's a shift in our mind. It helps us to think differently, to feel differently, and to really feel life from a different way. Buddhism is about waking up. It's about going from an unconscious to an awakened state. I think Shinran is saying that by reciting the Nembutsu, we realize that the joy of life is always there, and we just need to see it. So Buddhism is not so much about good over bad, but often good is the result of this type of thinking. And it's how the mind determines our reality. It's how we see the world. Changing our minds is what it's about. If our lives are difficult, we have to look to see what's causing it. Where are our clouds and mists? And this is a message we really need to hear at this time in history. Now, Saichi of Myokunin, a follower of Shinran, says this: consumed with anger, the world is an ugly place. Bathed in happiness, the world is a wonderful place. But aha, the same world. So you see, it is how we see the world that is important here. So how is our practice? How do we do this? What has been received? Now, this may be difficult for some of us because we may be stubborn. We have a lot of clouds that hinder our light. And so we have to practice to align our minds to be balanced. Now, let me demonstrate this way. How do we live our lives now? Now, this is an exercise you might do. I'll demonstrate it right now, but you might do this after the video. Get a coin and flip it. I won't flip it because I'll probably drop it, but I'll just shake it up and put it down. And then I'll call heads, and what I see is that it's tails. So I only have 0 out of 1. Flip it again, and I'll call tails, and it's tails. So I got 1 out of 2. So do this with the coin 10 times. Either flip it or shake it up, call it, see what you have. I have heads, and so it's 2 out of 3. So do this and see how many you get, whether it's 1 out of 10, 5 out of 10, 8 or 9 out of 10, or even 10 out of 10. How many times do you get it right when you call something, reveal what it is, and see whether you got that right or not. Now that's the first step. For the second step, we'll do this a little differently. Okay? Shake up a coin, put it on your hand, reveal it, and I see tails. So I call tails. That means I got 1 out of 1 right. I shake it up again, and I'll put it down, reveal it, it's tails. So I'll call tails again, 2 out of 2. Now you see I can do this 10 times. Each time I'll flip it, and I have heads, so I call heads. Do this 10 times on the second set, and see what you get. I hope everyone gets 10 out of 10. The first time we called something, we had an expectation, and we were either happy or sad whether we got it right. The second time, we revealed what we had, and then we called it. And it seems silly, but I want to ask you, how do we live our lives? The first way, where we have a lot of disappointments along with happiness, or the second way, where we get it right every time? Now, this sounds a little silly, but I want to give you the reason why I do this. My grandmother was known as a very devout Shin Buddhist. My cousin would say that she learned a lot from her, and that my cousin says she thinks she's an optimist because she lived with my grandmother. And to give you an example of what we're talking about here, when the family would go over there, and I could remember sitting down for a dinner, and everyone would be ready to eat, and we would say itadakimasu, and we'd be ready to start. And then someone would notice that there's no shoyu or soy sauce on the table. And as people looked around at each other to see who might get up, my grandmother would quickly get up and say, "Oh, ara e ambai." what good fortune. I can get some exercise. So you see, she automatically took a situation, saw what it was, and found a good positive reason to have it that way. And this is what it means to call something after it happens. You always get that right. So how did she develop this perspective? She was an Issei from Japan, first generation. Grew up in Japan, came over probably in her early 20s. There were a lot of hardships in her life. But living and growing up in a Japanese community where she didn't even have to learn to speak English very much, she absorbed the character and the disciplines of that Japanese-American community. Now, I think Shin Buddhism has really influenced the culture and language of Japan. So much of our principles have influenced practices of just etiquette and language and the way we interact with each other. And so it was this developing her thought of how she saw life. She led a very hard life, as many people in that time did. Being an immigrant, she arrived in America in San Francisco in 1906 during the time of the earthquake, so her ship had to land in Seattle. It was hard for immigrants at that time. She lived through the Depression. And of course, in 1942, as a Japanese American, she was moved inland, away from her home. Her husband had died the year before that. But after returning to California, someone had burned down her home and store that she owned. And so there are many things that she had that were very difficult for her. And yet, she persevered. And that, I think the qualities in Japanese where it says shikata ga nai, things can't be helped, and gaman, be patient and persevere, that she just accepted what happened and went forward. So that's how she developed this thought of appreciating what she had. But what about those of us who have no background in Japan or Japanese culture? What can we do? Well, I think it takes a gradual practice. And I think the key to this, as Shinran says, is voicing the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu. And the key to experiencing the real deep meaning of that in English is the experience of thank you, receiving a gift. And so we will continue with following videos on how we can proceed with this process of saying thank you, of making a shift from please to thank you. And thank you eventually can lead to Namo Amida Butsu, or the chant Namman Dabs, and to a spiritual awakening. So we are now in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic. Many things are happening to us. I want to thank the people in San Diego for staying at home. Because of what we've been doing, fortunately, the death rate and the infection rate has been relatively low in California. And so I encourage everyone to continue to stay at home, as uncomfortable as it may be, but it's for the betterment of others. And so in this time that's different and difficult, how can we shift our perspective, take a crosswise leap, and shift from please, I want it a different way, to thank you, I appreciate what I have. And so with that thought, I want to challenge those of you listening to put these thoughts into a practice. And whenever a problem or a thought comes up that challenges you, see how you can shift your mind to think of a way of saying thank you. So with that, let's express our deepest expression of appreciation reciting the Nembutsu. Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namanda.